Only one, but there are some things in my life that I have said that I have instantly regretted. And that doesn't even include half the things that I've said to my wife. So, there is one story in particular that continues to haunt me throughout my life. It was a cool, breezy summer day, and we were over in my neighbor's yard practicing with the baseball pitching machine and just getting some hits in. And now, I was by no means the Babe Ruth of my neighborhood, but on this day, I was connecting with the ball like I was born to play this game. Now, there were about 6 of us hitting the ball. There was myself, my 2 neighbors whose house we were at, another neighbor from down the street, and then 2 other neighbors who were from further up the street. And these 2 up here I did not know as well. They lived further out. We hadn't met them as many times. One was a year older than me, and one was a few years younger than me. And as I was finishing up hitting the ball, one of them walked up and said, "You know, you're hitting it really well. How are you doing that?" And I looked back at him, bat still hanging over my shoulder, said, "Just good practice, I guess. When you're my age, I'm sure you'll be just as good." And he looked at me, and I could see the anger boiling in his eyes. And that's when I realized he was the one who was older than me, wasn't he? And that was when I realized that the words that come out of our mouths, they come from someplace. Our gospel reading for today tells us that they flow forth from our heart. And in that moment, my heart wasn't in the right spot. The words I said were guised to be helpful, to be encouraging even, but in my heart they started out as, "You should look up to me. Try and be like me when you're older." And that message did not come from a heart that genuinely cared for the person whom I was speaking to. It came from a heart that wanted to be praised. In the first part of our gospel for today, Jesus is explaining this very thing. The words we say originate from within us, and sometimes what is within us isn't as pretty as the words that come out. Sometimes the things we say come from a place of pain. They come from a place of desire, a place of greed or bitterness. And when they do, these words don't nourish, they destroy. Jesus is speaking to the Pharisees, but it is a message that we all can hear. But understanding the context of this story can help us to better understand exactly how prevalent this is. Now, to give you an idea of the timeline of what's going on here, we just previously had Jesus feeding the 5,000 and then taking a stroll through the sea, followed up by Peter's attempts to take a stroll through the sea, which did not go as well. Now, in Matthew, right before our text for today, the Pharisees confront Jesus as he's healing people around Galilee. They see the disciples eating food without first washing their hands, and therefore making everything that they're putting into their body unclean according to the law. Now, from a sanitation perspective, they're pretty dead on. I mean, after spending the last 9 weeks working in the hospital, I swear that I will never again eat food without washing my hands first. But on a spiritual perspective, they're speaking from hearts that don't truly want to bring benefit, but instead want to bring harm. And in this moment, Jesus turns their words against them and points out that it is not what goes into the body that harms, but what comes out of it that shows the brokenness of their being. Jesus continues with a parable, and we suddenly see Peter, poor Peter. Matthew chapter 15, is not nice to Peter. First off, you have him trying to walk on water and not quite making it. Then you have him here asking Jesus, "What does this mean, Lord?" And he just looks at him and says, "Are you also still without understanding? Do you not see that whatever goes into the mouth enters the stomach and goes out into the sewer? But what comes out of the mouth proceeds from the heart, and this is what defiles." Now, luckily, As I've mentioned, I've spent the last number of weeks in the hospital, and I have spoken to many patients whose ability to go home is strongly linked with the truth of Jesus' first statement. Jesus is basically saying, the things you eat, they don't stay with you. You're going to be losing those here. So if anyone ever tells you the phrase, you are what you eat, you can look them right in the eye and say, according to Matthew 15:17, I poop what I eat. So there. But the things we say, these things reveal the truth of our heart, and therefore these are the things that can make us unclean. And wrap, isn't that a nice message? Jesus wins, the Pharisees lose, the disciples scratch their head a little bit until they figure it out. It's nice, and it's clean, and it's neat, and it's tidy. And it's also not the end of our gospel. You see, this passage and the story of the Canaanite woman are connected, but it's not clean. It ruins the tidiness of the first part of the gospel. As we enter into this next part of the story, we see that Jesus goes away from the region of Galilee. In fact, the word in the Greek that's used is often translated as to flee. And so you get this idea that Jesus is running away to the non-Jewish part of town. There are many who suspect that Jesus was, in essence, getting out of Dodge, that he had upset the Jewish rule keepers, and so he needed to lay low for a while. So off he goes to Tyre and Sidon, and while he is hanging around there, a woman begins to shout to him, "Have mercy on me, Lord, Son of David. My daughter is tormented by a demon." And here is Jesus' response. He says nothing to her. It almost makes you have to stop and double check. This is Jesus, right? The guy who heals the sick, who gives sight to the blind. The disciples suggest that Jesus send her away. After all, she's being loud and disruptive, and this is not the kind of thing you need when you're hiding out for a while. Plus, this is a Canaanite woman. She's not even Jewish. Yet she approaches Jesus as if she were. "Have mercy on me, Lord. Kyrie eleison." We just sang those words today. As we still say in our services, "Lord, have mercy." She also says, "You are the Son of David," a term that might be pretty loaded around those parts of town when you consider that David was the king of the people who came in, who took their land. Yet here this woman is, honestly begging for help from one who many might consider an enemy. We can understand this bad blood because we see it still in the world today. Palestinians and Israelites, Russians and Ukrainians, Shiite and Sunni Muslims. The world is full of people groups who have a history of division and angst. And in the midst of this, you have two voices in a conversation. Jesus finally replies to the woman after the disciples prompt him. "I was sent only to the lost sheep of Israel." But the woman is not deterred. She sees a chance at her daughter's freedom, and she doesn't let go. She kneels before him, begs him again, "Lord, help me." And Jesus responds, "It is not fair to take the children's food and throw it to the dogs." Say what? I don't know about you, but if I imagine myself in that crowd watching this happen, Jesus, I'm a little confused. You are Jesus, right? Did you forget to wear your WWJD bracelet this morning? A woman is begging at your feet, trusting in your power to bring healing to her daughter, and you call her a dog? A scavenger trying to take the food that rightfully belongs to others? I don't know about you, but this is not the attitude of Jesus that I learned in Sunday school. But the woman in the story is not discouraged. "Yes, Lord, yet even the dogs eat the crumbs that fall from their master's table." Do you know how many people get the last line on Jesus in the New Testament? Anybody got a guess? This woman, just this woman right here. Now we have to remember that the primary way that Gospels were told was verbally within the spoken community. And so as we gather here today, throughout the centuries, Christians would gather together and proclaim the gospel. And oftentimes there would be large chunks, and so we wouldn't necessarily have the short pieces that we have today. The writers of the gospel wrote them so that events would tie together as a whole story, as opposed to reading them in small sections at a time. So when hearing these words, a listener might just look back to the last chapter and remember that Jesus found a way for 5,000 men plus women and children to be fed. And there were 12 baskets of pieces left over. 12 baskets of broken pieces of bread, of crumbs. In movies, this is the flashback. Suddenly, we see the grand leftovers of the miracles Jesus had performed to the Jews. And this woman asks, are those just going to waste? The woman asks, does the Son of God feel the need to keep even these from the rest of the world? Couldn't a small portion fall to her daughter? And with this, a Canaanite woman sways the convictions of Jesus. Great is your faith, he says. Let it be done. And the daughter is healed. Interestingly, this doesn't appear to be a one-time thing. After this reading, Jesus goes and heals again, and all who see it, the Bible says, are glorified the God of Israel, which would make one assume that they weren't already doing that. Otherwise, why would you specify it? And were therefore not Jewish people being healed, but Gentiles, Canaanites, the dogs. If they were from outside of the house of Israel, then this encounter with the Canaanite woman radically changes the scope of Jesus' ministry. The gospel, it would seem, is going to the dogs. The dogs are being fed straight from the table. In fact, 4,000 dogs are going to be fed in verses 32 through 39, just like the 5,000 children of Israel were fed earlier. And this is a radical shift. This is a change in the entire scope of the ministry of Jesus from a conversation with one Canaanite woman. It's a shift that gives us hope, because the words that Christ first spoke to the Canaanite woman could be put side by side with the words of the Pharisees. The Pharisees say, your disciples can't eat because they aren't clean. And Jesus said, you can't eat, you can't have this miracle because it doesn't belong to you. Both of these statements focus on the rules, and they aren't clean. But the difference at the heart of Christ's words is a willingness to see that the rules don't trump the power of God's love. Christ's last words to the woman show that his heart is flowing, and the words that come out are coming out from the right place. Great is your faith, so great that I can no longer follow what I've said, so great that I can no longer follow the rules that I've followed in the past. Thanks be to God. The good news is that even Jesus could come to a different opinion. Jesus is our example of one who received advice from a very unusual source and who used it to make a change. And through it, thousands of lives were changed. Those who were on the outside have been brought in and brought to the table. It's a wonderful thing to have a message of Christ's willingness to change. Christ, who we always see as our rock, the steadfast one. It can be hard to relate as people whose lives are constantly in fluctuation, are constantly in change. But here we see Christ willing to follow wisdom, willing to say, no, this is what's right. And this is a message that brings hope. Because if Christ came only for the children of Israel, then we would all be out of luck. We, like the Canaanite woman, would be the dogs sitting at the foot of the table. But thanks be to God that Christ shows the wisdom in change. In fact, today even, he offers us crumbs from the table. So as we gather to eat these small crumbs of the presence of Christ, we hold strong to the promise that even in these crumbs, we find the fullness that is God's power and love, that even this small bit is sufficient for us. Amen.